Welcome back, everybody. Today we're looking at Chapter 14, Section 1, Industry in the North. And this is our first official lesson for Chapter 14 and for the third marking period. I know it's hard for me to believe as well, but we are moving into Chapter 14, and as you kind of got an idea from the vocabulary and from the introduction, we're going to be looking again at the push westward and things that were happening in the north and things that were happening in the south that will eventually ramp us up to the Civil War, which we will talk about at the end of this marking period. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So in Chapter 14, Section 1 and Section 2, we're looking at in life in the north, economic life, and then social life. And then in Sections 3 and 4, we will turn and look at the South, at the industry in the South, and then general life in the South. And specifically for today, let's get back into Section 1. So our essential question for today is, what role did new inventions in faster transportation play in the way that goods were manufactured and shipped? And as I'm doing this recording, if I also did voice recordings, and there's a picture here of a little invention that we will talk about later on in our discussion today. So let's look at some of the key terms for today. A telegraph, a locomotive, and a clipper ship. So these are three different either inventions or things that were improved upon at this time that helped with industry in the north. Now, before we go through today's lesson, if you have not downloaded the worksheet already, you can either click on the blue link right here that says download the guided reading worksheet, and that will bring up this worksheet right here. It says Chapter 14, Section 1 quiz, but it's going to be everything that we'll be discussing today. So in the first three sections, you either need to put clipper ship, telegraph, or locomotive and insert those key terms where they belong. And then for the second part, understanding the main ideas, you need to answer each of these questions in the space provided. And we will actually answer all 6 of these questions today as we're going through this lesson. So it would not be a bad idea to copy this down and work through them as we work through our lesson today. So question number 1, how did inventions change farming in the 1800s? Question 2, how did inventions change manufacturing in the north? Question 3, what challenges did the first railroads face? Question 4, how did railroads overcome these problems? Question 5, why was the telegraph important? And question 6, how did railroads contribute to the industrial growth in the north? So you will need to answer each of these questions using a complete sentence, and you have a couple of different options on how to submit this. You can either copy down all of these questions into a Word document or LibreOffice and send me the questions, send me the answers that way. You can scan or download the worksheet, write in, and then scan it and send me that as either a JPEG file or as a PDF. Or you can write your answers in the text box at the bottom of this page. I'm not really concerned about the format that you use. I just want to know that you answered all the questions correctly, and if you have any questions, we can start a discussion about industry in the north. So with that having been said, let's move into our discussion for today. New inventions. Now, throughout the early and mid 1800s, the economy in the north came to depend more and more on industry and trade. And this is something that we've talked about a couple of times before, but it's something that's continuing throughout the early to mid 1800s. And at this point, most people in the United States still lived on farms, but more and more were moving into cities, moving into industrialized areas, and giving up their farms and starting to work in factories. And there were new inventions and improvements on existing inventions that made people's everyday lives a little easier than they had been. Some such inventions and improvements, Isaac Singer was one inventor who actually improved on a man named Elias Howe, improved on his sewing machine, which greatly sped up the time it took to sew a shirt. So this is one improvement on an existing invention. Now, a man named John Deere came up with a lightweight steel plow that took advantage of interchangeable parts. Now, this new plow, it was an improvement on existing ones because this new plow could be pulled by a horse instead of earlier plows that required full teams of oxen. So it made work easier and cheaper for farmers. And there were other farm machines like the thresher, the hay rake, and the reaper, which helped farmers to grow more crops with fewer workers. And as a result of these improvements, thousands of farmers moved west into uncharted areas to start new farms. Well, since there weren't as many farmers needed, some of these farmers that didn't move west to try and strike out on their own left their farms and moved to cities to try and find factory jobs. Now, one of the most important inventions of this time is pictured right here, and that is the telegraph, or talking wire. The telegraph was invented in 1844 by a man named Samuel F.B. Morse, and the telegraph sent electrical signals along a wire to a receiving unit, and it used a series of long and short signals known as code. And using this code, two people could use the wire to communicate over long distances. And the code that was used has come to be known as Morse code, after the inventor Samuel Morse. And I'm going to click on the play button here and give you a quick 15-second demo of what the telegraph actually sounded like. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know Morse code, so to me that was just a series of like beeps and more beeps, and some are longer and some are shorter. But a person that is versed in Morse code would have been able to interpret that and give that message to whomever it was for. Now, Congress actually gave Morse funds to run a telegraph wire from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and on May 24th of 1844, he tapped out the message, "What God hath wrought," and a few seconds later, the same message was tapped back to him from an operator in Baltimore. And Baltimore, if you know anything about the geography of that area, Baltimore is 38 miles from D.C. So why is this important? Well, that was a message that went 38 miles and came back in just a matter of seconds. And this was a huge success, because now messages before that would take days or weeks to communicate to someone could now be received in a matter of minutes. Businesses could find out what the needs were in certain regions of the country, and then ship the goods accordingly. And for instance, farmers out west could find out about grain shortages in the east and ship grain to meet those needs. Communication is power.
Inadvertently, railroads also usher in a surge in communications. The telegraph lines that follow the path of the tracks provide a means for journalists to find out what's happening in other parts of the country.
Americans were absolutely obsessed with newspapers of all varieties. People would borrow one another's newspapers. People would read them out loud in public spaces. Often very large sheets of newsprint would be posted on the outsides of buildings so that people could come and read news as they walked by. And so it's very interesting to think about the population of the United States being absolutely fueled by this thirst for communications.
One of the things that the technological revolution created was the steam press, in which you could turn out thousands of copies of a paper in no time at very low cost and sell them all for a penny. And so the idea of creating a penny press to appeal to the urban masses was irresistible, especially when you figured out how to fill up these newspapers, not with long, dry treatises about constitutional issues, but gripping stories about murder and mayhem and, all this kind of stuff that everybody loves to read about. And using the cheap newspaper, both Democrat and Whig editors were able to reach out and influence a much wider public than they ever had before. And then, of course, they become hungry for news, and they start sending reporters out to gather up stories, subscribing to the Telegraph so that they could transmit information like, what's the price of cotton doing in this distant market? All those kinds of things become an increasingly important part of daily life and of political life.
Many people think that newspapers had a lot to do with Americans really feeling like Americans. They could read the news, they could feel a sense of a common cause with people elsewhere in the country who they might not ever meet or have anything in common with, and communication was very important for that.
So with the telegraph, farmers and businesses could learn of opportunities around the country, but knowing about something and being able to make a difference are two very different things. Transportation would have to build on the improvements that had already been made, which ushers us into the age of the railroads. Now, the first railroads looked a lot like this. They were horse-drawn carts that were being pulled along wooden rails, and they were mainly used to transport goods between canals. Canals at this time were that was like the major transportation innovation. So railroads were really just kind of went in between these canals. And it wasn't until 1829, with the invention of the steam-powered locomotive engine, that higher speeds could be reached. Now, the first locomotive could reach a whopping top speed of 30 miles an hour, but still, many Americans were hesitant to really embrace this new technology. Well, they were hesitant at first. Some of the reasons were people who worked in the canals, they were afraid of losing their jobs, and the early locomotives were not the safest things, and they had a lot of problems with safety, with reliability, and then there were soft roadbeds and weak bridges, which often led to accidents, not to mention the fact that the engines would spit out hot embers that would burn passengers and cargo. So even though you could go a little bit faster, a lot of people were really wary about actually using the locomotives because they saw them as being much more dangerous than just taking a horse and carriage. So for this industry to really grow, improvements had to be made, and they had to be made quickly. And I just wanted to take a look at this because this is all of the railroads that were in operation in December of 1840. So 1829, the steam-powered locomotive really comes to the forefront of the American public, and just 11 years later, you have rail lines running from New York to Philadelphia, down to Washington, from Fredericksburg, Virginia, all the way down to Wilmington, North Carolina, and then from Charleston, South Carolina, out to Madison, Georgia. So there's not a lot of rail lines, but there are some. You could get to a lot of places. So eventually, a lot of those problems were worked out, like the soft roadbeds and the engines spitting out toxic fumes and things. Stronger bridges were built, and the soft roadbeds were replaced with more solid ones. And specifically, a big improvement was in the rails themselves. These wooden rails that at the time were worked just fine for the horse-drawn carts. These wooden rails were replaced with iron rails, and by the 1850s, we're going to see a picture later, but by the 1850s, railroads crisscrossed across the entire nation. And interestingly enough, there was significantly more track laid in one section of the country than the other. I'm going to pull up this picture again. If you look between the North and the South, which one seems to have more track? If you were going to say the North, then you are correct. But why do you think they would lay more railroad tracks in the North than the South? Well, think about where the majority of the nation's industries were located. And this was just one more area where the North and the South would compete for the nation's resources.
The Industrial Revolution is also fueled by improvements in transportation. Until the 1820s, roads are the primary link between the East Coast and the country's interior. Hauling goods across country, given the conditions of the roads, is expensive.
Albert Gallatin, who was a Swiss emigre to the United States, had ideas early on that canals would be a good way to enhance both the transportation and the trade in the United States. His political allies like Henry Clay sort of adopted Gallatin's vision of internal improvements, as they were often called, while they continued to push for federal government control and federal government investment in canals. Many of the states also saw some of the benefits of canals.
Canals not only link distant parts of the country, they also encourage domestic trade.
It's not so much just trading with Europe that caused the economy to get better, but the fact that Americans could trade more with themselves and outside the East Coast. This trade also caused prices to go down very, very quickly for transportation. When the Erie Canal opened in 1825, certain transportation costs plummeted, which made it possible for whole new kinds of trade activity to take place.
Railroads are in their infancy during the 1820s and 30s, but in a relatively short period of time, they overtake the canals and all other modes of transportation.
Somebody got the idea of taking wooden tracks with carts that had been used to haul ore out of the ground for a long time, and actually putting them out on the surface of the earth, and you could haul things much longer distances that way. First, they were just going to use horses to pull these things along, but then this other invention, the steam engine, comes along, and somebody gets the idea of putting a steam engine on a cart, and it can pull a whole lot more than a horse can. So you have the development of the steam railroad, which is this enormously revolutionary invention, and then they also discover you could put steam engines on boats, and then you can go upstream very quickly and easily. So you get steamboats on the Hudson and some of the eastern rivers, but then sooner or later on the Ohio and the Mississippi, and they are carrying that cotton and pork and wheat and flour and lumber and all this stuff eastward, where it can be processed into goods. So this transportation revolution, if you will, works hand in glove with this market revolution to create an economic basis for Western expansion.
The Yankee Clippers. Now, this is a dumb joke, but I couldn't resist. So, okay, back to history. So, we're looking at improvements in transportation and in and around the United States with the development and the improvements of railroads. Now, railroads had a huge impact on trade within the country, but trade with other nations improved also at this time, and a lot of it can be traced to this right here. This is a clipper ship, and sea captains of the Northeast would load up their ships with cotton, furs, wheat, lumber, tobacco, to trade around the world. And the key to trade is speed. And in 1845, a man named John Griffiths launched the Rainbow, which was the first of the American clipper ships. And a clipper ship is a sleek ship, so it's narrow, but it has very tall masts with a lot of sails that would catch even the smallest gust of winds. And their narrow hulls clipped easily through the water, hence the term clipper ships. Now, I never fully understood what the word clipper was, but the term clipper originally was applied to a fast horse because the term clip meant speed, as in going a good clip. And so these ships, with their sleek, narrow hulls and many, many sails, broke every speed record in the 1840s and cut what originally was a 5-month trip from New York to Hong Kong down to 81 days. So that is a significant cut. This helped to make the United States a leader in international trade in the 1840s and 1850s. Well, unfortunately, this reign on top of world trade was very short-lived, because in the 1850s, Britain launched steam-powered ocean liners that could carry more cargo faster than the clipper ships. So at one point, these clipper ships were the fastest thing on the water, but that was very, very short-lived. So what does this all mean? How do we put all this together? Well, we've looked at improvements in communication, land transportation, and sea transportation, all of which improved in a very short time and kind of all improved together. So, but what about manufacturing? If you don't have a product worth trading, then why bother trading? Well, throughout the 1830s, factories started moving away from water power and moving towards using steam power. Why the change? Well, one big reason is that machines run by steam were much cheaper to produce, and another big reason was that steam power allowed factories to be built anywhere instead of being limited to being next to very swift-moving rivers. Before, remember that a lot of the factories that were being built were water-powered, but with moving towards steam power, you didn't have to lock yourself near a river. You could build a factory really anywhere you wanted.
For this reason, a new invention called the steam engine came into wide use in factories, and because it used coal for fuel, it was no longer necessary to build factories next to rivers. Although steam engines had begun to be used to run machines as early as the 1720s, it wasn't until the late 1700s that steam power started to be used in factories really efficiently. A steam engine works like this. Water is heated by wood or coal in a boiler. As steam is produced, the pressure in the boiler increases. By turning a handle, the steam enters the engine through a valve. The steam pressure then pushes the piston down, which in turn moves a heavy flywheel. Then the piston is returned to its starting position as high-pressure steam pushes on the other side of the piston. When the engine is running at full speed, the piston moves back and forth very rapidly. Pulleys or gears attached to the flywheel can then be used to run almost any kind of machine.
So factories improved, such as, like, this was one of the original steam-powered mills in Niceville, Georgia, the Nathy Grist Mill. And so factories improved and new machines made it possible to produce more goods at lower costs, so the actual production improved. Families could now purchase pre-made clothing fairly cheaply instead of having to rely on making it on their own. Factory goods could be purchased and shipped on railroads all around the country. And as this was going on, towns across the country became new markets for factory-made goods. And as we mentioned at the top of the page, improvements in farming equipment caused some northern farmers to move out west to start their own farms. And with the growth of railroads, as we see in this flashing picture, many of the farmers that stayed in the north really couldn't compete with farms out west. Food grown in the West was cheaper and it was much more plentiful, so farmers continued to move into cities to take jobs in factories, or they would become sailors. And as they took jobs in factories, the factories could expand the production, and the growth just kept on going and going and going and going.
The switch from water to steam power sped up the Industrial Revolution and led to huge changes in manufacturing, farming, and transportation. Factories that started using steam engines were more efficient than water-powered factories and could be built far away from rivers. Steam engines also began to be used to run machines for mass transportation, such as railroads and steamboats, and this made it possible for people to travel long distances in a very short amount of time. The use of steam engines in farming for things such as threshing grain led to greatly increased food production and helped to revolutionize agriculture. But because steam engines burned wood or coal, smokestacks became a very familiar sight, and air pollution increased to the point that it began to cause serious health problems in the industrial cities. Naturally, as the popularity of steam-powered machines grew, the appetite for coal and iron increased as well. More and more mines were developed to supply industry, and large-scale mining itself resulted in tremendous environmental damage in many parts of the world.
Which brings us to the assignment. Now, once you have completed the worksheet in any of those forms that I told you, either printing out the worksheet and writing on it and then scanning that, or typing your answers into a Word or LibreOffice document, or typing your answers into the text box here at the bottom of the page. Once you've completed it, make sure that you send it to me so I can check your answers, and also hold on to it because it'll help you as you're studying for the Chapter 14 Section 1 and 2 quiz, the Chapter 14 test, and so on and so forth. So, all right, well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I will see you later.